Hello, Green Bay SLPs. We hope that you are doing well and have adjusted back after break. And this week we are moving into Module 3, and we are going to go over a school age criterion reference tool called the Student Language Scale, or the SLS. Just an overview for this module. First, we'll go over that student language scale. We'll talk about what it is. We'll talk about how we can use it. We'll make a connection to the academic standards and social emotional competencies, and then we'll end with a couple case examples and the value that this tool can add within an assessment. So as IDEA states, we need to use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather our information during our evaluation, and we should not use any single measure or assessment as that sole criterion for identifying a student with a disability. So the SLS is just one small tool that you might consider using within your evaluation. It is an evidence-based questionnaire that can be used to gather multiple perspectives regarding a student's language and literacy skills, and it can give insight into areas of strengths as well as areas of need. It is primarily used for the school-age population, so ages 6 to 18, and a teacher or parent or caregiver can complete it, and it is relatively quick and short, which is nice. Students can even complete it too. It's not as reliable and valid when students complete it, but it can give some good insight. So we're going to focus on using it mainly with teachers within today's module. So this tool has been validated and it's very reliable. And what's really interesting is this tool actually started out with 52 questions, and throughout their process of making it more reliable and valid, they narrowed it down to 12 main questions. So when we look at the validity of a tool, we want it to meet the recommended level of 80%. So this gets into that sensitivity, or how accurately a tool identifies a child at risk for language and literacy difficulties. And for teachers with the SLS, it's 92%. And the specificity, or that ability to identify a child who is not at risk for language and literacy difficulties, for teachers is 90%. So both of these are above that 80%, which indicates that this is a very valid tool. It also has high intra-rater reliability, meaning when a teacher rates a student a second time within 6 months or less, there's high consistency between their own prior ratings, so we can feel pretty confident that the changes we're seeing between the teacher's first rating and second rating are accurate. So it can be a useful tool to see changes in a child's performance over time. So the SLS has three main purposes. The first purpose is that it can be used as a universal screening tool. So you can gather information from teachers and parents and accurately identify students with language and literacy difficulties that might suggest a further need in Tier 2 or further evaluation. I know within the school setting we have limitations about how we can do screening, or how we really can't do screening. So it could be a tool that your school uses, maybe your classroom teachers use it or something like that. That's not going to be our focus for this tool within this module. We can use it to gather input for an evaluation and planning. So like I said previously, we can learn about their strengths and their needs and get multiple perspectives about a student. And a third purpose for it is school-home communication. So if teachers or other professionals are using this tool, they can use it to gather input about all students within a classroom, or maybe a specific group of students they're working with, and use it as a discussion tool during something like family teacher conferences. Our main purpose for this module is going to be focusing on using the SLS for purpose number 2, gathering input about a student. So like I previously said, it's going to give us more insight into those strengths and needs and help us figure out where we can dig in a little bit deeper and learn more about a student. We can see those multiple perspectives. So if we have one or two teachers fill it out and maybe a family member, we can look at their ratings and we can see similarities and differences. We can get a better holistic picture of a student. It can help us prioritize needs at an evaluation meeting for potential IEP development. So we can look at those areas where individuals agree on ratings For mutual concerns, we can triangulate those priorities, what's going to really help this student be successful, and then we can also discuss differences. If one teacher is rating a student higher in a certain area and another teacher is rating them lower, we can dig into why, so maybe we can understand what is facilitating that success in one setting, but maybe not another. And that also helps us document that educational impact. So we can look across multiple settings and contexts as well as multiple people and understand where a student might be struggling and why, and maybe where a student is more successful and why. The SLS has three main parts. First is the rating scale, where individuals are going to rate a child on certain abilities. Then below that rating scale, there's an ability checklist where teachers can note things that are easy or hard for the student. And then the last section is an open-ended priority question. So the rating scale consists of 12 statements describing various language and literacy skills and related abilities. So a teacher is asked to complete this and rate a student on each of these items compared with other students of the same age. So questions 1 through 8 have a language and literacy focus. And then questions 9 through 12 are the related cognitive and social skills that are related to language and literacy. And then a teacher is asked to rate a student on a scale of 1 to 7, with 1 being not good and 7 being very good. After a teacher completes that rating scale, they're going to move down to completing the ability checklist. So this is a duplicated list with language and non-language skill areas from the rating scale. And teachers are asked to note things that they feel might be easiest for a student, and then to note things they feel might be hardest for a student. And then there's a spot for them to put any additional comments that they feel might be helpful. Last, teachers are going to complete this priority question. So what one thing do you think is most important to help a student do better at school? So it's meant to be open-ended, and it allows us to collect multiple perspectives if we're having multiple individuals fill this out. So it can be something as simple as reading, or maybe the teacher writes a sentence and they have a couple things, but we're really trying to get them to pinpoint 1 or 2 things that they feel would be really important for this student. So we've created a detailed document for you with directions on how to administer the SLS, how to score it, and interpret it. So I'm not going to go into all that detail right now. I'm just going to hit the basics, but it's pretty straightforward. It's only going to take a couple minutes to read over, and it will be on our Google Drive for you. So don't feel like you need to write down everything I'm saying right now. So I'm going to go over a little bit of scoring, a little bit of interpretation, and then you'll have that detailed document to follow up on. So the scoring directions are often used when we're using this tool as a screener, but like I previously stated, we're not using it as a screener, but rather that purpose number 2 of gathering input about a student. So we're going to reference these cut scores as our criterion. So the criterion for pass would be that all items, or all but one, are at a level of 5 or above. Something to note though is that if a child scores a 5 or a 6 on the first 8 items, it still could signal a milder concern about language and literacy difficulties. So it doesn't mean that they're good to go, and there might, there still could be some concerns, but maybe not significant enough to be identified with a disability. The criterion for fail is 2 or more of the first 8 items are rated at a level of less than 5. So when a student fails, it indicates further assessment is needed, or in our case, that there is some concern. So it could be consistent with the presence of a disorder. And we know that these tools don't diagnose. It's just one little tool that we could be using within our assessment to get some insight as to a child's strengths and needs and where they might need a little bit more help. So again, we're using it to get input, look at multiple perspectives, look at needs, and look at strengths. So the manual states this little saying here to kind of help with that fail piece. So 2 or more, less than 5 on the first 8. So that's kind of our criterion, our gold standard that we're going to be referencing for a child having some difficulties. When we interpret the SLS, we're going to follow that rule of thumb, 2 or more, less than 5 on the first 8 items. When you see ratings that are a little bit lower on items 1 and 2, this relates to school vocabulary when listening or talking. When you see lower scores on items 3 and 4, that relates to reading, decoding, and spelling. Items 5 and 6 look at listening comprehension and spoken expression of stories, so that's going to be a number we're very interested in, just like 1 and 2. And then items 7 and 8 relate to reading comprehension and writing. So I know that some of these areas get into reading, and we know that, language and literacy is highly correlated. It's difficult to separate at times. So something to keep in mind is that this tool can be useful when you're on a team working with multiple individuals, so you can share insight with a special education teacher, with a school psychologist. Just because a student is rated higher or lower in a certain area does not mean that we are responsible for that area. So it's just a tool that can be used across a team to provide insight about a student. And then items 9 through 12, relate to the cognitive and social aspects that relate to language and literacy. So these aren't considered in that fail criteria, but they are still important. So it could mean that a child has difficulty with executive function skills or something like that. Now that we know about the SLS, we know how to score it, and we know how to interpret it, what are we going to do with this information within our evaluation? So one way that we can use the information is to connect it to the state academic standards and/or the social emotional learning competencies. So during some of my coaching sessions, some SLPs express not always being sure what's expected or where to go next with a student. And so these standards and competencies can be really useful to reference. So the Wisconsin Academic State Standards provide multiple competencies that students should be meeting at different grade levels. So it's content specific, it's end of year goals, and it specifies what a student should know and be able to do in the classroom. So it's those goals for teaching and learning. And some competencies directly examine speech and language skills, for example, the speaking and listening. And most competencies require strong foundational communication skills for a student to demonstrate proficiency. So it can be a really rich source of functional communication skill information, and that's how we can connect it to the results from the SLS. We also have state social emotional competencies, and these outline knowledge and skills that we want students to have in order to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve goals, establish and maintain relationships, and make responsible decisions. So the links to these standards will be in our shared Google Drive, and they can also be found on DPI's website. So now that we have a little bit of information about the SLS, we're aware of these standards, we're going to move into some case studies of showing how you can connect your SLS results to some standards and how that can give you some really important information about your student within an evaluation and support IEP development. All right, so here we have a young girl named Lizzie. And she is a first grader, and she has been referred for concerns having a hard time expressing herself and some difficulty with reading. So this is an initial evaluation. So as we are completing the review of existing data, we note some of the following information. So academically, she's having some difficulty with reading and writing, as well as vocabulary and math word problems. We also find out that she is receiving Tier 2 reading intervention that's been focusing on decoding, comprehension, and then making some connections to spelling and writing. And the reading teacher shares that she has been making steady progress, so that's good. When we ask a little bit about some cognitive, social, emotional skills, the teacher said that she can generally focus and she's pretty organized. Maybe a little concern with her memory. Overall, she has good peer relations, but sometimes her peers might be confused when she's talking about something or explaining something. She has good play skills and she can problem solve, but again, sometimes a little bit of difficulty explaining or conversing about problems at times. As far as communication goes, there's those language difficulties that the teacher's noting. No speech sounds, no voice, no fluency concerns. Social communication is a strength for the most part, and just really a little bit of difficulty expressing herself, explaining things, and then talking about stories. So the teacher says, she's fairly independent. She does ask for help most of the time, and there really isn't any other physical or health concerns. So we're working through our evaluation plan, and we decide to include the SLS as an assessment tool that we're going to use for this child. So then once your consent has been received, you give the SLS to the teacher. So this is the SLS results that you get back from the general education teacher. So at a quick glance, you can see some lower ratings, and we're going to apply that criterion rule 2 or more less than 5 on the first 8 items. And by glancing, I can see that she does not pass. So when I look at some of these areas, I can see that 1 and 2 relate to vocabulary, and they're at a 4, so there could be some concern there. When I look at number 3 and 4, those relate to decoding and encoding, and so I can see that makes sense. She is in a reading intervention. Number 5 relates to understanding a story, so that listening comprehension. So there might be some concern. It could be okay. And then 6 and 7, telling a story and understanding a story. Those might be some areas to dig into. And then writing is difficult, which would make sense. If some of the reading and language skills are hard, we know that writing can be challenging. And then when I look at items 9 through 12, these are some of those cognitive and social aspects that relate to language and literacy. And I can see that following directions looks like it could be okay. And, the teacher noted some memory concerns, so there might be a little difficulty there. And then we see that items 10, 11, and 12, so that organization, paying attention, and then those social skills, those are generally okay. Maybe not really any concern there, but just something we'll keep in the back of our mind as we're working through this. And then we look at that ability checklist, which is not pictured here, but the teacher noted that some things that are easiest for Lizzie are art, being social, and that she loves to draw pictures of stories. Some things that are hardest for Lizzie include reading and writing. So the teacher said decoding is hard, and sometimes we're not sure what she understands. And then that priority question, which is not pictured here either, the teacher states the most important thing for Lizzie would be reading skills. So we know that reading intervention is supporting that decoding and encoding, reading comprehension, and a little bit of the writing. And so in a perfect world, this would be a team evaluation with a school psychologist and a special education teacher, and we would be looking at this child as a whole and doing that comprehensive assessment. I know that doesn't always happen, but that would be considered a comprehensive evaluation for this specific child. So we are really going to focus on some of these language skills like vocabulary, listening comprehension, as well as narrative language. Now that I've gotten the SLS back for Lizzie, I am going to connect it to some of the first grade standards, some of those first grade academic standards. So we know that vocabulary was rated a little bit lower, listening comprehension could be okay, maybe challenging, and then spoken expression or those narrative skills are challenging. So I'm going to dig into some of the first grade speaking and listening standards, as well as some of the first grade reading standards. Now, these standards, they provide support for us to look at a little more of what's expected in first grade. Now, keep in mind, these standards are what's expected at the end of first grade. So they provide a frame of reference as we move through our evaluation and we kind of know what's expected. So we know what Lizzie should be able to do by the end of first grade. So it can help guide our observations. It can help us guide collecting work samples, and there are aspects to keep in mind as I'm using different tools and maybe getting some ideas for possible dynamic assessment, so I can see how much support she might need with some skills. So the first standard that I look at is this standard here on the left, comprehension and collaboration, and that falls under speaking and listening. So we know that Lizzie should be able to ask and answer questions about details in a text read out loud or information presented orally. So that's getting into that listening comprehension. So I'm keeping in mind that when I do an observation, maybe it's during a shared reading time so I can see how she answers questions. Or if they have a little follow-up activity after listening to the teacher talk about something in science, I can see how is she doing with that. And then on the right here, we have key ideas and details, and this is under the reading standards for first grade. And this gets into reading informational and reading literature. So I know that, again, she needs to be able to answer questions about key details in a text. She should be able to identify the main topic, that main idea with some support, and then be able to retell those details. And then describe characters, settings, and important events in a story or information text. So that's good to know. And we do see that some support is okay in first grade. So that's good to have that idea in my head as I'm going through my evaluation. Let's say I'm collecting a narrative language sample and maybe she doesn't do very good. That might be something that turns into a dynamic assessment so that I can see how much support does she need, and is it a significant amount or is it just a little bit to really determine if it is a disability. So now I want to reflect on what value was added by using the SLS and connecting it to the standards. So we can see that by using that SLS, they didn't pass using that criterion. So it's a good indicator that the student is at a higher risk for language and literacy difficulties because we know this is a valid and reliable tool. So it was a good referral. And obviously we're not going to make any decisions off one tool. This is just a small piece of data that we're going to consider in the bigger picture of all of our assessments. It gave us some areas to really focus in on in our evaluation. So you can have more focused observations, collect more specific work samples, and you can do all of this before you're done with some of your other testing in your comprehensive assessment, which is kind of nice. You can target some of those observations early on as opposed to doing some of your testing and then doing observations. So it just gives you a little more flexibility. Along with those areas to really focus on, we made those connections to those standards. So now I have a better idea of what's expected in first grade. So based on her performance and possible level of support that I might determine through a dynamic assessment, I can know if this support is excessive, a significant amount of support, or if she just needs a little bit, I know if it's appropriate or not. So keep in mind, these standards are what we expect at the end of the year. So even if she does need some support, it might be okay depending on the skill and depending on how much support she needed. And then we can also look at that SLS that the teacher completed to support and document that educational impact. We did see some lower scores. So depending on how all of her results come out together and we converge all that evidence and put it together, we can see, is there really an educational impact and is there that significant discrepancy that would be indicative of a disability? Here is another student named Princeton that we want to try the SLS out with. So he is an 8th grade student due for a re-evaluation and he's been on your caseload for a couple years. And you are considering if dismissal from speech and language is warranted. His current disability category is OHI, and he does have a diagnosis of ADHD. And he currently receives academic services for math, reading, and writing, as well as executive function skills from a special education teacher. And then speech and language has supported language, as well as some social communication skills. We get this SLS back from his special education teacher. So in that last case with Lizzie, we had the general education teacher fill it out, and this time we're having the special education teacher fill it out because Princeton does receive some pull-out services for academics. And you could also have a general education teacher fill it out as well, so you could kind of compare and look at those multiple perspectives. So at a quick glance, you see some lower scores, and we're going to apply that criterion rule, 2 or more, less than 5 on the first 8 items. And we can see that on items 7 and 8, he does have a score of 4, so that would mean he doesn't pass. And it's not surprising because he is currently in special education and receiving a variety of services. So, you know, that's a good indicator that there may be some continued needs for him. So if we kind of start up here at number 1 and 2 Vocabulary is something we've supported in the past. He seems to be doing okay. Reading, decoding, and spelling seem to be okay. Understanding a story when listening and telling a story seems to be okay. That reading comprehension and writing, a little bit lower, which isn't surprising. Following directions can be a little bit challenging, which again isn't surprising. We know that he has ADHD, so some of those executive function skills can come into play there. And then number 10, being organized, again, executive function skills and paying attention. Not surprising given his disability category and that diagnosis of ADHD. And then interacting socially seems to be okay too. So, you know, overall his scores aren't necessarily low in all areas, but there's some areas to still keep in mind and consider. So we can see that vocabulary, decoding, spelling, listening comprehension, and that spoken expression are looking okay, maybe some mild concerns. And then we get that ability checklist back and we see that music, sports are easy for him. He loves track and he loves being active. And then something that is the hardest, the teacher noted, is writing and some executive function skills. And then that priority question, the special education teacher wrote, getting organized and developing plans with checkpoints. So based on some of those areas that you've been supporting, you're going to decide what standards to look at. So if we look over here on the left, in the past we have supported vocabulary acquisition and use, and that is looking at some of those language standards in 8th grade. And so we know that he needs to be able to determine and clarify meaning of unknown words, use context clues, maybe use some prefix-suffix knowledge, and we have supported that. And we feel that he's been doing well based on our therapy data and talking with multiple teachers. And then we've also been supporting the social communication skills and kind of working on perspective taking. Sometimes Princeton runs into a couple issues with peers just because there might be some misunderstandings, and so we've been supporting that. And if I go into the social emotional competencies and I go to grade 8, and just keep in mind these are in grade bands, so 6th through 8th grade, these are the skills we expect. It said that learners will be able to show respect for different perspectives, as well as negotiate and conflict resolution skills to resolve differences. And again, Princeton has been doing fairly well with this. We have good therapy data to support it. We're going to complete some more observations, and we feel that we have some good information on him. So we know the special education teacher and school psychologists are going to do some updated academic testing, look at those executive functioning skills, and you know, these standards provide support for what would be expected at the end of 8th grade. So again, gives us that frame of reference as we're going through our evaluation. And we can see that most of his language skills are okay. You know, there's a few standards relating to the supports and goals that we've worked on. And so we can look at our therapy data, we can get some updated testing, updated observations, and see where he's at. And then we can make a solid case for dismissal. Or, you know, if there were more needs popping up, we could make a case to continue seeing him. But in this case, we are really trying to get towards that dismissal. And I think, you know, we have some good standards, some good therapy data, as well as that SLS to back us up that it seems like he's doing pretty good and might not require that specially designed instruction from an SLP. So reflecting on the value added from the SLS and making those connections to the standards and the competencies, we can see that, you know, there is a good indicator this student does still have some language literacy difficulties. However, they might not need our direct support for those skills anymore. So again, this SLS and these standards are just one small piece of data that we'll consider in the bigger picture. And we can see that the teacher has completed supports dismissal. We have our therapy data. There doesn't seem to be significant impact from his language skills or social skills anymore. Mostly executive function in the areas of organization, planning, and attention. So something a special education teacher could support. So when we put it all together, and we would put that in the context of our bigger evaluation with different observations, tests, work samples, things like that, we can see that that educational impact from a communication standpoint isn't necessarily significant at this point. He still does have, you know, an educational impact from that reading, writing, and some of those executive function skills, but not necessarily in the communication and language aspects that would require us. So during that evaluation meeting, we can share some valuable insight. Maybe we help develop some additional accommodations, and maybe we would move to consultation, or maybe we would completely dismiss. So that would all be up for putting everything together and deciding the best route to meet this child's needs. So before I jump into the application activity for this next module, I want to just address some cultural and linguistic considerations for the SLS. So the SLS was developed and standardized for students in the United States who've been learning English since birth. So it could include dual language learners whose family members may communicate more comfortably in a language other than English, but it has not been validated as a screening tool for students learning English as a second language unless they've been speaking English since birth. But it can be used for the other two purposes, so gathering input and that school-home communication. So in our case, we're using it for gathering input. So you could still use it with dual language learners, multi-language learners, and gather important input, but it would just be something to keep in mind and always kind of interpret some of those results with a little bit of caution. All right, so jumping into the school age application activity, rounding out this module. I know this one has gotten a little bit longer, but hopefully you've made it to this point so far and learned some valuable information. So if you go to our shared Google Drive, you're going to find detailed instructions with all the links and all the information that you need to complete the application activity. So we want you to kind of review those administration directions, scoring, and interpretation. So there's a document for that. Should only take a minute or two to read over. Then we want you to review a case study. So there are two options for two students with different ages, so you can kind of review those and pick which one you prefer. Then we would like you to submit a Google document with brief notes about the value added and how you might use the information if you were working with or evaluating this child. So consider, what did you learn? How might you follow up with a teacher, or how might you use the information? And then if you want, you can try referencing a standard based on your interpretation of the student's SLS if possible. So maybe you just go to speaking and listening and you pick one standard at that student's grade level. And then during your coaching session, we're going to discuss some of the information that you learned from your case study, the value you think it added, and how you might use that information. And then if you have an evaluation coming up and you want to try this out with a real student, go for it. Feel free to explore using it. There's those administration directions, and then you can also request a copy of the SLS form from your lead SLPs. And as always, feel free to reach out to myself. Feel free to reach out to John if you have any questions or you're having difficulty accessing anything. Please know that we're always here to provide support.